We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Kellan Baker, Executive Director of the Institute for Health Research and Policy at Whitman-Walker Health, a nonprofit community-based health organization specializing in LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS care. Dr. Baker, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Emma.
Of course. So last week, there was a 400-page report that was published by the Department of Health and Human Services, led by conspiracy theorist Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and it essentially backs conversion therapy for trans kids, is my reading of it so far. Take us through what this report means and how inaccurate much of the contents are.
Yeah, I think it's important to start first with what the report is not. It is not a clinical practice guideline. It is not a standard of care, and it is not a policy recommendation. So I think it's really important to understand that, because the way that the report is being presented by the administration and by many people out there in the world is that it does have something meaningful to say about clinical practice. But again, this report is not a clinical practice guideline, and it is not a new standard of care. What it is a very concerning example of politics dressed up as science. There are a number of things that you need in order to do good science, and this report has none of those things. So just very briefly, you need a good research question. All good science should start with a good research question, right? What are you intending to find out? And unfortunately, when you look at where this report came from, it was literally commissioned by the executive order that banned the very care that this report is supposed to have undertaken to assess. So what we have here is a post hoc putting together of something that is to justify a decision that has already been made. And to be perfectly honest, if we caught a graduate student in a lab making something up in order to justify something that had already been decided or had already happened, then we would call that bad science. We would have a problem with that. And unfortunately, that's really what we're seeing here, is a real lack of a substantive research question, in the sense of, do we actually want to find something out? Or are we just looking for a justification of something that we've already decided?
It feels very reminiscent of what happened in the UK with this CAST report. Is that a fair parallel to draw here? The anti-trans movement in this country borrows a lot from what Turf Island is doing over there, and it seems like this is a version of that.
The CAST report was commissioned in the UK in order to address a problem. In fact, in order to address a problem that in some ways is not dissimilar to the United States, the issue of people having to wait a very, very long time in order to get the medically necessary healthcare that they need. And so the CAST report actually comes to the conclusion that the full range of treatments that are outlined in the existing expert standards of care should be available, because they are important. It calls for good research. It calls for, again, availability of all of the different treatments or different approaches that are outlined in existing standards of care. This report goes so far as to even claim that there is no way to do good research in this area. This report gives us no answers as to what should be done for young people who are experiencing gender dysphoria, for young people who are trans. It simply has the predetermined conclusion that there is no group of people for whom these treatments that are outlined in expert medical standards of care are ever appropriate. So it has not just a finger on the scale, but an entire fist on the scale, saying that there are essentially no benefits of the standard of care that is practiced by clinicians in the US and the UK, around the world, and going so far as to really deny the existence of transgender people themselves. The report goes to great lengths to use language that makes clear at every turn that whoever put this report together, and I think that's another important element of this to point out, is that there is no knowledge as to who actually wrote this report. If this is science, then you do good science and you make it available and you talk about it openly. You put your name behind it because you would hope that you did good work. But what we see here is an anonymous report that was written by some sort of gang of eight of people who we have no knowledge of who they are. And what they're recommending in this report is really a worldview that does not comport with reality.
I mean, the whole RFK Jr. takeover of our healthcare policy, and really the movement that he represents, that the Trump administration has embraced it tangibly, is an anti-peer review, anti-science concept. So it's anti-establishment, and in their view, it's the scientific establishment where these sneering experts who come together and review people's hypotheses, and if they don't find your conclusion accurate, they're just elitists. Like they see that as the problem, and they see that the standards of care that have been agreed upon via an exhaustive peer review process or via a doctor's using this kind of these standards of care in practice with their patients, they view that as the threat as opposed to helpful data to build healthcare policy. It's inverted in a way that I don't necessarily know if people have fully grasped the scale of how destructive an assault on peer review with healthcare looks like.
Yeah, and I mean, you really see this not just in transgender health, but in so many different areas, right? If we think about some of the political responses to things like the COVID-19 pandemic, to vaccines in general, to questions of whether raw milk can make you sick, right? There's very substantial bodies of evidence that show what science actually tells us. And then there are a lot of political opinions that, particularly over the last couple of years, but especially now over the last couple of months, have really suddenly become government doctrine. And all of a sudden, we have this incredibly, to use your phrase, inverted perspective where the federal government itself is spouting some of the very worst types of conspiracy theories that are not just anti-science, but are fundamentally dangerous. We have rules and regulations in public health or in healthcare or in food safety because we want to keep people safe, because we can look at the science and we can tell what are the things that are going to help people be safe and healthy and well, and what are the things that are dangerous. And unfortunately, what is happening now is, again, a complete inversion of the idea that the government is supposed to be part of helping to keep you safe. Instead, what we have now is the government as a megaphone for some of these incredible conspiracy theories that used to be confined to, I would guess, the darkest corners of the internet, but now we're suddenly finding expression and outlet in all kinds of prominent platforms. And that is not just concerning from the perspective of science and medicine, but downright dangerous.
Right, and you work at Whitman-Walker Health, and it's a nonprofit community-based organization. So I feel like this is especially relevant. The idea that this is just this broader attack on healthcare in and of itself, and almost a weaponization as like a form of modern eugenicism, whether it's about denying the existence of trans people, pushing them back into the closet, which is a death sentence in many instances, denying their care, or the survival of the fittest bent of this like kind of anti-vax quackery. The attack on abortion rights, you can also put in that bucket. The assault on DEIA, that includes accessibility. The way that that autism is approached by the administration, to where it's working backwards from treating people if they have a disability or if they're trans as a malady, and using and making the policy fit that preconceived notion about folks, because when we're talking about food safety and the more broad things that will affect us all, if you're wealthy, you're buying organic anyway. Like some of the standards where that stuff is going to be cut, it's going to affect people where they're already maybe buying meat that is inorganic, or that food is cheaper, where there's corners that can be cut. That's what I think the whole ideology, the umbrella philosophy really is. I don't know if you agree with that assessment.
Yeah, I think, you said, mentioned about these issues that affect us all. And I think it's too frequently easy to think that, this is just something about transgender people, or, oh, this is just something about one particular small, group of people. But what we're actually looking at here, both with this kind of broad-based assault on science overall, as well as this report particularly, is something that is incredibly concerning for all of us, because this is not really about trans people per se at its root. What it is about who gets to make decisions about your own life, who gets to make decisions about what kind of healthcare you can get. And when you look at a report like this that just attempts to brush aside decades of scientific and clinical evidence, that is an assault on the ability of any one of us, transgender or not, to go to our doctor and to actually get the healthcare that we need. And what we're seeing here is a real substitution of bureaucrats with a very clear political agenda in place of your doctor. And it's happening today for trans people. It's happening today in terms of people, in access to reproductive health care. But it is something that threatens us all, because ultimately what we want to know is that we're able to go to the grocery store and get, healthy produce and, know that it's not going to make us sick. We want to be able to go, any of us wants to be able to go to the doctor and get the care that our doctor recommends, because it's important for our health and well-being. And the trends that are really manifested in this report, as well as in so many of this administration's policies to date, are completely antithetical to our freedom to move through the world as people who are safe and happy and healthy and well. And that's just incredibly concerning, no matter which way you look at it.
And I'm going to ask if you don't mind touching on your personal experience as a trans man and having healthcare having, I guess, access to healthcare. You can speak for your own experience, but maybe just what it looks like for kids that need things like puberty blockers or hormones, or won't be able to get the care that they need at this critical stage of their development, perhaps because of these actions by the federal government. Like, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I am alive today because of the care that I was able to get. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s when nobody really knew the word transgender. It certainly wasn't something that I ever heard. And I didn't have really any help. I mean, it was a time when there were very few understandings available broadly in the world about who transgender people were. And I was fortunate that I came of age, when transgender people were becoming more visible. And I actually transitioned when I was living in Moscow, Russia. I was working as a translator. And the fact that it is harder today for trans people, particularly young trans people, in more than half of US states to get the medical care that they need than it was for me 20 years ago in Russia indicates to me that the United States has a very serious problem. The United States has long been a leader in biomedical and scientific innovation. It has long prided itself on being a place where people can get the healthcare that they need. Now, we have a lot of issues with our insurance system, but in terms of sort of the medicine that is practiced in the United States, it has long been seen as a world leader. And the fact that the United States is now walking away from an international medical consensus, is walking away from evidence-based standards of care that have been developed over decades by experts, is something that, again, is not just concerning for trans people, but is so deeply concerning for everyone.
Can you speak about what that care looks like in practice? It's mystified by these right-wing reactionaries, but the processes that perhaps you had your unique experience, but even as a provider yourself, that your clients, or I'm not sure exactly what kind of healthcare you do. So, or what trans kids, what that interaction is like typically when you deploy these standards of care with their doctor, what trans care looks like, so people can understand it a bit better.
Yeah, so I'm a researcher. I'm a scientist. I have a PhD in health services research, which means I study the design and delivery of healthcare services. I do a lot of work in insurance. I do a lot of work in terms of understanding evidence-based medicine and how that translates into clinical guidelines. And so from the perspective of the standards of care, which have been around for decades, are maintained by organizations like the Endocrine Society, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, the American Academy of Pediatrics. What those standards are really outlining is an individualized and age-appropriate approach to care for a transgender person. No matter what age they may be, it is incredibly important that this care is individualized. And I would just note that that stands in complete and stark opposition to these bans, right, where the whole purpose of the standards of care is to note that there is no one-size-fits-all approach for everyone, because the healthcare services that transgender people need, they need to be individualized and they need to be age appropriate. When you have a ban, by contrast, that literally says there is no ability for understanding anyone's individual circumstances. I am just going to ban that care outright. So it's completely, these bans are completely antithetical to standards of medical ethics, to standards of care, the way this care is provided. When we're talking about children, young people before the age of puberty, all we're really talking about is listening to a young person when they tell us who they are. You know, for example, I've had my hair. I mean, I had more hair back in the day. You know, this is, but same haircut all the way from, you know, when I was a kid in the early 1980s until now. Now that might be referred to as social transition, which just means, you know, that if a young person wants to cut their hair in a particular way or wear a particular type of clothing or, you know, use a name that feels more comfortable, that's the only type of support, the only type of care that we're talking about before somebody hits puberty. And when you do hit puberty, it's, you know, well known and documented in the literature that this can be a particularly distressing time for transgender young people. So the point there for the standards of care is to hit the pause button. Nobody wants young people making, you know, impulsive, quick decisions. None of this is quick. None of this happens, you know, over. I mean, we're talking about multiple doctor's visits. We're talking about multiple consultations with mental health providers, with entire teams of providers. And the recommendation, again, when young people hit puberty, is to hit the pause button so that you don't have that pressure of, oh, I need to make a decision. You know, I need to think through what the next step is immediately because of this kind of ticking time clock of puberty. So puberty pausing medications have been used for decades. They are very safe. They are very effective. They're very well studied. And they're very often prescribed.
Including on cis kids that need puberty blockers. And you can have states like Florida that okay puberty blockers for cis children, but not for trans kids.
Yeah, and that is exactly what's at stake in so many of the legal discussions, I guess, or you know, legal cases around these bans. Is you have these laws at the state level, but this is something that is being proposed at the federal level as well, that say as long as you're not transgender, you can get this care. So if you are a non-transgender young person who needs puberty pausing medications, you can get them. But suddenly, if you're a transgender young person, you can't. And that has absolutely no basis in medicine or science. It also, I'm not a lawyer, but would appear to me to have no basis in the law either, because that's a textbook case of discrimination. You are looking at someone and you are taking into consideration who they are as a trans person or as a non-trans person. And for that trans person, you are saying you cannot have access to these safe, beneficial, effective medications that you could have if you were not transgender. that's a clear-cut case of discrimination. And that is unfortunately exactly what all of these bans are doing.
Well, the Supreme Court just said that the Trump administration can implement its trans ban in the military. So the enforcement on this kind of discrimination is just not going to, it's going to be non-existent for the next 4 years at least. But the part that I also wanted to make sure we got to before I let you go is what the report gestures towards in terms of conversion therapy. We know the effects of gay conversion therapy. There are countless stories, documentaries from my time growing up. I remember reading about it, seeing stories, and it kind of informing my worldview about what it was like to be gay in this country. And the pressure, I'm from the East Coast, so it was a little bit more acceptable, but how there are these religious communities throughout the country that almost drive LGBT or gay or lesbian kids to suicide because they try to change who they are with these intensive, traumatizing conversion camps or therapy sessions. And we had largely agreed as a society that this is maybe, these things should be outlawed. They're still in existence, but that this is wrong. And that was a lesson out of the Bush era going into the Obama years. Now it appears like this administration is endorsing trans conversion. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's unfortunately really important to note that this report is an endorsement of conversion therapy. And the reasons for that are, if you look at the standards of care are very clear that mental health support is a critical part of medical care for transgender people of any age, but particularly for young people. So the standards of care already support the fact that mental health support, guidance, throughout the process is really, really important. But what this report then does is it says, no, not that type of mental health support. What I mean is a psychotherapeutic practice. I wouldn't even actually call it therapy, but a psychotherapy practice that takes a vulnerable young person and treats who they are as a transgender person as a pathology or as something that's not real. These approaches that frequently go under the term gender exploratory therapy, the report uses the phrase exploratory therapy, have these kind of twin principles at their core. And the one is either being transgender is not real. And the report, again, is very clear in a lot of the language that it uses, that the idea that transgender people are real is not something that this report believes in. And sorry, here we are. Right. These psychotherapy approaches that are being discussed are not going to make trans people or trans young people not trans. They're going to make them miserable. And the other principle that this report really endorses is that it is possible it is possible to change someone's gender identity. So even if there is a therapist or a conversion therapy practitioner who acknowledges that gender identity is real, they then think that it's changeable and that it's actually possible and beneficial to try to change a core fundamental part of who someone is. And what we know, to your point about the literature and the experience of anti-gay conversion therapy, is when you take a vulnerable young person, you sit them down and you say, I don't believe anything that you're telling me about who you are. And in fact, I think that what you're saying about yourself is a pathology. I think there's something wrong with you. And I think we better explore that in order to root it out, in order to eradicate it. So what these exploratory therapy approaches really do, again, it is an incredible misnomer, because true mental health support meets people where they are and supports them throughout their journey. But exploratory therapy specifically says, I have a predetermined goal, and that predetermined goal is that you are not trans. And that is both impossible and incredibly damaging, exactly the way anti-gay conversion therapy is. Telling people that who they are is a pathology and trying to get them to change a core fundamental part of who they are is dangerous.
It is a level of, I mean, there's so much pop psychology that's thrown around these days, but this is gaslighting to this deeply harmful degree that also involves the deployment of societal and often religious shame that I don't think we can understate or overstate, I should say, what that does to somebody who's still exploring who they are and they don't have a sense even fully of their own identity, but they know they feel a certain way. The level of trauma that engenders and that creates, this is why suicide rates for LGBTQ people, unhoused rates as well, because you have parents that buy into this thing and kick their kids out and they end up on the street. Why those levels are higher than other groups. This is the direct result of that kind of approach.
Yeah, I mean, I know what it was like to grow up in the 80s and 90s, and this feeling the feeling that there was something wrong with me, the sense of shame that I was somehow wrong. And God forbid I had a therapist who sat me down and gave me that same message. God forbid I were a transgender young person growing up now, where we have bullies at the highest levels of power using their political platforms, their megaphones, to tell trans kids that there's something wrong with them. We have data from places like the Trevor Project, which is an anti-suicide hotline for LGBTQ young people, and they have done research looking at the mental health harms of the current environment that we are in, where transgender people are being treated as political footballs. And again, God forbid that you, as a young person, go to speak to somebody that you think is going to provide you with mental health support, is going to help you and care for you. And instead they sit you down and they tell you there's something wrong with you. And we're going to explore it to get to the root of it. And we are going to change it. That is so incredibly harmful for young people. Right.
I mean, and there's a version of this with abortion. Those trucks that would go around and offer people care, and then they walk in and it's a religious fundamentalist saying this is
centers.
Right. Yes, thank you for reminding me of the name of those. Except as I delineated earlier, and as you speak about with your experience, this is about someone's whole identity too, and that is what the danger is here, and we're putting it mildly, but I really appreciate your time today, Dr. Kellan Baker. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Dr. Baker is the executive director of the Institute for Health Research and Policy at Whitman-Walker Health. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.